5 true scary stories from nights out with friends. Unbelievable encounters you won't believe. The dim glow of the neon sign outside the small bar flickered, casting a soft, almost eerie light on the quiet street corner. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, with the hum of casual conversation and clinking glasses filling the air. The bar had the comforting feel of a place that had been around for decades. Its worn-out booths and polished wood counter telling stories of countless nights like this one. It was the kind of place that welcomed you with open arms after a long day. Nothing fancy, nothing flashy, just a simple refuge for those in search of good drinks and good company. A group of 5 friends had gathered at their usual spot near the back, a round table that had become their domain over the years. The worn-out leather chairs creaked as they settled in, a familiar ritual. Laughter spilled from their lips as they shared stories of past adventures, their faces lit up by the soft glow of the hanging lights above them. It was the kind of night where everyone let their guard down, reminiscing about their most memorable nights out, recounting wild escapades with no thought of the darker side of life. Each friend brought something different to the table, from the skeptic who never believed in anything supernatural to the sensitive one who always seemed to sense when something was wrong. There was the brave one who would face any challenge head-on, and the cautious one, always looking for signs of trouble before anyone else did. And then there was Mark. Mark had always been quiet, but when he spoke, it was with a weight that made people listen. He had an intensity about him, a kind of unspoken tension that suggested there was more to him than he let on. The kind of person who could go on a night out and come back with a story that made everyone uneasy. As the night wore on, the conversation drifted to those types of stories, the ones that make you pause, look over your shoulder, and wonder if the world around you is really as safe as you thought. They talked about close calls, strange coincidences, and the oddities that sometimes seemed too big to be explained by logic. But that was just the fun of it, right? Spooky stories to share over drinks, adding a bit of thrill to the evening. Then, without warning, Mark leaned back in his chair, the smile on his face fading just enough for the others to notice. His voice, usually quiet and calm, dropped lower as he began to speak. "I've got a story for you guys," Mark said, his eyes flickering with something that could have been hesitation. The group fell silent, sensing that this wasn't going to be one of the usual tales. Mark wasn't the type to tell ghost stories just for fun. When he spoke, you listened. "It happened a few years ago. One night when I went out with some friends," he began, his voice steady but laced with an edge of something dark. "We were just out having a good time, like we always do. But something happened that night. Something I couldn't explain, no matter how much I tried." The group leaned in, the lighthearted mood suddenly shifting. The clink of glasses and the hum of voices around them seemed to fade, replaced by a tense silence. The air in the bar felt heavier now, as if the room itself had begun to listen too. "I'm not saying it was a ghost," Mark continued, his eyes scanning the faces around him. "But there are things that happened that night I still can't shake off. Things that I thought were just coincidence, until I started to wonder if they were something else entirely." The others sat in rapt attention, the kind of interest you get when someone begins to speak of the unknown, the unsettling. Mark's story was about to begin, and as he spoke, the group's comfortable camaraderie was replaced by a creeping sense of unease. "What happened that night?" someone finally asked, the words breaking the silence, but only adding to the tension. Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip from his glass, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. The others waited, hanging on his every word. "I'll tell you," Mark said, his voice softer now, "but you might regret hearing it. Because once you know, there's no unknowing it." And with that, the first story began. The air around them grew thick, and the once light-hearted group of friends found themselves pulled into a tale that would shift the course of their evening, perhaps their lives forever. They weren't just here to share a drink anymore. They were about to dive into something far deeper, something far darker. The mood had shifted, and they couldn't shake the feeling that, by the end of the night, their understanding of reality might never be the same again. Story 1. The Lost Night in the Forest. It was one of those crisp autumn evenings when the trees seemed to stand a little taller, their branches twisted and gnarled against the darkening sky. The leaves, painted in hues of red and gold, fluttered to the ground like confetti, caught in the occasional breeze that sliced through the forest. The group of 5 friends had decided to get away for the weekend, eager to escape the bustle of city life and embrace the quiet of nature. They were seasoned hikers, each one used to the paths of local forests, the thrill of the great outdoors. This time, however, they had chosen a new spot, one deep in the woods, far away from the usual hiking trails and familiar landmarks. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, the group set up camp. A small fire crackled to life, casting an orange glow that danced across their faces as they settled around it, each with a drink in hand, laughing and joking as if the world outside their circle of warmth didn't exist. The kind of night where everything feels easy, comfortable, and far removed from any sense of danger. But then the atmosphere began to change. As the night deepened, the moon rose high above the treetops, casting an eerie light on the forest. The wind began to pick up, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made the trees sway in ways they shouldn't, making the air feel both peaceful and suffocating at the same time. The forest felt alive in a way that was almost unnatural, as if it was watching, waiting. It was at this point, after the group had shared a few more drinks, that James, the more adventurous of the group, suggested they take a walk through the woods to explore. The others hesitated, but the alcohol and the carefree mood pushed them forward. They grabbed their flashlights, set off along a narrow path that snaked through the trees, and began to hike into the heart of the forest. The darkness seemed to swallow them as they walked deeper and deeper into the wilderness, the trees towering above them, cutting off the light of the moon. There was no sound except the crunch of dry leaves beneath their feet and the occasional snap of a branch breaking in the distance. For the first time, a shiver ran down their spines, but they shrugged it off, attributing it to the cold night air. Then, something happened. As they continued to walk, the path they had been following suddenly disappeared, swallowed by the thick underbrush. Confusion settled over them, and they stopped, looking around, trying to make sense of their surroundings. The once familiar woods now felt alien, disorienting. The trees looked like they were closing in, the air thick with something unspeakable. James, who had always prided himself on his sense of direction, was now unsure which way to go. The path was gone, and they were standing in the middle of the woods with no clear route back. "What the hell?" Mark the skeptic muttered, his voice tinged with unease. "I thought we were on the trail," Sarah said, her voice wavering slightly. "This doesn't feel right." The group stood there for a few moments, scanning the dark forest around them. The wind had stopped, leaving an almost unnatural silence hanging in the air. Then a sound, soft at first, barely audible, drifted through the trees. A rustle, a snap, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, or something else. "Did you hear that?" James whispered, his face pale. The unease in his voice was unmistakable. At first, they thought it was an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, almost as if something or someone was following them. Panic began to settle in as the forest seemed to shift around them. The shadows moved, shifting unnaturally with each flicker of their flashlights, and the rustling of leaves seemed to come from every direction. They tried to keep their bearings, to stay calm, but each step deeper into the woods made them feel more lost, more disconnected from reality. With every turn, the path seemed to change or vanish altogether. The trees loomed above them, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like the fingers of some ancient being. The further they went, the more disoriented they became. "I don't like this," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. "We need to find our way back." But the more they tried to head back, the more the woods seemed to disorient them. The trees felt like they were closing in, the air thick and suffocating. They could hear something now, voices, low whispers carried by the wind, unintelligible and chilling. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. "Something's wrong," Mark muttered, his earlier skepticism now replaced by genuine fear. "We're not alone out here." The whispering grew louder, more insistent. The The shadows seemed to shift, forming shapes that flickered just outside the edges of their flashlights. As they stumbled further, disoriented and exhausted, the oppressive feeling that something was watching them, waiting, grew stronger. Finally, after what felt like hours of wandering, they came upon a clearing. The forest was eerily silent now, the whispering gone, but the dread didn't leave. They collapsed onto the soft ground, breathless and wide-eyed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. And then, almost as if the forest had taken pity on them, they found their way back to the campsite. But something was wrong. The fire they had left burning when they first left was now a dim, cold ember, as if hours had passed since they had last seen it. The group looked at their phones. No service. The GPS, however, told a different story. They had been miles away from where they thought they were. They had wandered deeper into the woods than they ever should have, but they couldn't remember how they had ended up back at camp. What the hell just happened? Mark's voice broke the silence, his eyes wide with disbelief. None of them had any answers. They all had the same nagging feeling in the back of their minds, that they hadn't just gotten lost, that something else had been at play, something older, something that wasn't quite human. As the night wore on, the atmosphere at the campsite shifted. The group was unnerved, but no one spoke of the events aloud. Some of them dismissed it as exhaustion, the product of a long hike and an overactive imagination. Others, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something darker had followed them out of the woods. Whatever it was, it had left a mark on them all. And as the fire sputtered out, casting long shadows across the forest, they all knew they weren't safe. Not here, not anywhere. Story 2. The Haunted House Party. It was Jessica's turn to speak, and she leaned forward, the flickering light of the campfire casting long shadows across her face. The group fell silent, their gazes fixed on her as she began her story. "I've been thinking about this a lot lately," she began, her voice soft but steady. "It's a memory I've tried to forget, but it's impossible. It keeps coming back, haunting me. I still don't know what to make of it." The others exchanged looks, their curiosity piqued. Jessica wasn't one to share personal stories easily, and they could tell this one was different. She was reluctant, hesitant, but when she spoke again, the words came out in a rush. "It was a few years ago, right after I moved back to town. Some of you might remember the old house on the edge of town, known to everyone as the haunted house." The group nodded. Everyone knew the house. It had been abandoned for years, the decaying walls and broken windows a reminder of its eerie reputation. No one dared go near it, and the stories surrounding it were enough to keep even the bravest away. But, as Jessica explained, when they were invited to a party there by an acquaintance, someone they barely knew, the curiosity had gotten the best of them. At first, it seemed like just another wild night out. The house was isolated, far from the center of town, and it was well known for its dilapidated appearance. But the invite was enticing, and the allure of being part of something different, something mysterious, was too much for them to resist. They thought it would be a fun, harmless adventure, just a little thrill to spice up their evening. As they arrived, the house didn't look quite as abandoned as they had expected. The front door, once boarded up, stood open, revealing the dim light flickering through the cracks of the house. From the moment they stepped inside, something felt off, though they couldn't put their finger on it. The floors creaked under their feet, and the musty scent of mold and old wood lingered in the air. The group laughed nervously, attributing their unease to the spooky rumors and the overactive imagination of someone who had probably watched too many horror movies. "I'll admit, I wasn't too keen on staying at first," Jessica continued. "But everyone else seemed excited, and the music was loud, the drinks flowing freely. We got caught up in it all, and for a while, it felt like any other house party." The group danced and drank, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows against the peeling walls. But as the night wore on, things started to change. At first, it was small, almost imperceptible, a chill in the air that seemed to come from nowhere. One of them, Mark, complained that he felt cold despite the heater running. But when Jessica touched the wall near him, it felt like ice. "Hey, I think I saw something move," Sarah said, her voice slightly shaking, her eyes wide with confusion. Everyone turned, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows, long and twisting as if they were alive. For a moment, they brushed it off, just the lighting, the alcohol, their nerves playing tricks on them. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger, and the unease in the group deepened. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from upstairs, followed by an unsettling whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "I swear I just heard someone say leave," Jessica said, her voice trembling now, her heart racing. I looked around, but everyone was still partying. It didn't make sense. The music had stopped, the laughter died down, and a strange silence hung in the air. The temperature in the house had dropped drastically, and as they moved through the rooms, the oppressive atmosphere began to sink in like a heavy fog. And then it happened. Jessica was walking down the hallway when something unexpected occurred. She felt a rush of air, and then, out of nowhere, she was pushed violently from behind, her body slamming against the wooden railing of the stairs. Her heart leapt in her throat as she scrambled to regain her balance, but no one had touched her. "Did you see that?" she gasped, her voice barely a whisper, her pulse racing. The others were already staring at her, wide-eyed, their faces ashen. But none of them had seen anyone near her. It was as if an invisible force had thrown her. A chill swept through the group, and the heavy silence that followed was broken only by the distant hum of the wind outside. But it didn't stop there. The house, as if responding to their fear, began to manifest its malevolent presence in full force. The whispers from the walls grew louder, and the air felt thick, as though something was pressing down on them from all sides. And then, as if by some unseen hand, the lights flickered and went out completely, leaving them in pitch blackness. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, began to echo through the house, though they could see nothing. "Who's messing around?" Mark demanded, his voice trembling with nervous laughter. But the sound was not human. It was something far older, far more sinister. They could feel it moving around them, getting closer, stalking them. The group huddled together in the living room, their eyes darting from shadow to shadow, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when they noticed something that made their hearts stop. A figure standing in the corner of the room. A silhouette, shrouded in shadow, its features indistinguishable but unmistakably human. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished. "No, no way. We need to leave," Sarah whispered urgently, her voice cracking. "Now!" But when they moved to leave, the front door wouldn't open. It felt as though something was holding it shut, an invisible force that refused to let them escape. Panic set in as they scrambled for another exit, but the house seemed to close in on them, trapping them inside. And then, as the group began to search the house in a frenzy, one of them, Mark, was gone, vanished without a trace. They called his name, rushed through the rooms, searched every dark corner, but there was no sign of him. No Mark, no sound, just the echoes of their own voices calling into the dark emptiness. When they finally managed to escape the house hours later, it was with a sense of dread and confusion. The house, as they looked back, seemed unchanged except for one thing. There was no sign of life, no party, no lights, just an empty, decaying house. When they returned to town, they did some research. The house had been abandoned for years. No one had lived there in decades. But in their minds, it had been alive, full of people, music, laughter. They had all been convinced it was a party, and yet none of it had been real. The house had played tricks on them, warping their perception of time, of reality. They never spoke of the incident again. The experience had shaken them all. But what haunted Jessica the most was the question that lingered, unanswered, in the back of her mind. Had they truly experienced something supernatural? Or had their minds snapped under pressure, pushed to the edge by fear and uncertainty? The answer, she knew, would forever elude them. The haunted house had taken more than just Mark. It had taken a part of them all, and they could never escape its hold. Story 3. The Curse of the Abandoned Cemetery. It was Sarah's turn to speak, and she was the one who had been quiet the longest, her usual skepticism replaced by an eerie stillness. She cleared her throat, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her glass as she spoke. "All right," she began, her voice steady, but carrying an underlying tension. "You've all heard of the cemetery on the edge of town, right? The old one that no one dares to go near." The group nodded, some of them exchanging nervous glances. The cemetery was a known part of their town's history, though few dared venture near it. The iron gates, rusted with age, were as much a warning as the overgrown ivy that blanketed the stones like a protective shroud. It was rumored to be cursed, the stories filled with tales of restless spirits and eerie occurrences. Sarah wasn't one for superstition, but even she had to admit there was something about it that felt wrong. "We took a road trip out there, just a small group of us," she continued, her eyes distant as she recalled the memory. "It was the kind of stupid idea that seemed fun at the time, a thrill for the weekend. But none of us were prepared for what we'd find." It had been late afternoon when they arrived, the setting sun casting long, eerie shadows across the crumbling cemetery walls. The trees around it seemed to grow denser as they got closer, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers. There was no sign of life nearby, not a sound but the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds that seemed to echo unnaturally in the quiet. The place felt abandoned, as if the world had forgotten it existed. "At first, it wasn't so bad," Sarah said. "It just looked like any other old cemetery, maybe a little more overgrown than usual, but not too creepy. We thought we'd just walk around for a bit, take some photos, and call it a day. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, everything changed. The air grew thick and heavy as dusk settled in, and the once innocent graveyard began to take on a far more sinister aura. The gravestones, weathered with age, seemed to shift in the dimming light, their inscriptions barely legible. It was as though the ground itself was shifting, the graves moving and rearranging in subtle, unsettling ways. A strange, unnatural chill swept through the air, making the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. One by one, the group grew uneasy, a sense of dread creeping over them as they walked deeper into the cemetery. Sarah's friend, Tom, who was always the most carefree of them, suddenly stopped and stared at one of the gravestones for a long time. "I swear, that's not where that stone was before," Tom muttered, his eyes wide. "It was on the other side of the path." At first, they thought he was just spooked, but then, to their horror, they noticed something else. The other gravestone seemed to be moving, ever so slightly, as if being disturbed by some unseen force. The shadows seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, and the temperature dropped rapidly. The trees around them, once quiet, now seemed to whisper in a language none of them could understand. The silence of the graveyard was shattered by the faintest rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of voices that seemed to come from all around them. "Maybe we should go," Sarah suggested, her voice trembling now. "This place it doesn't feel right." The others agreed, but as they turned to leave, something far more sinister occurred. Tom, who had been the most adamant about exploring, suddenly froze. His face went pale, his eyes glazed over, and he began to speak in a voice that wasn't his own. The words that came out of his mouth were not in English, but in some old, foreign dialect that none of them recognized. His voice was deep, guttural, and filled with a chilling resonance that made the ground beneath their feet seem to tremble. "What the hell is he saying?" Jessica asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah could hardly breathe. She tried to call out to Tom, but it was as if he couldn't hear her. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his hands began to tremble violently. Slowly, as if compelled by some unseen force, he began to walk toward the center of the cemetery, his steps deliberate and unhurried. The others tried to stop him, but it was as if he was being controlled by something far more powerful than they could understand. "We need to leave," Sarah insisted, her voice shaky, her pulse racing. "This isn't just some prank. Something's wrong with him." But as they turned to leave, they realized they were no longer standing at the cemetery's entrance. The gates, which had been open when they arrived, were now closed, locked shut. The iron bars that had once been loose and rusted now stood firm, as though welded in place by some unseen force. "Let us out," Mark shouted, banging on the gates, but they didn't move. It was as though the very cemetery itself had decided to trap them inside. Panic began to set in, and the group scrambled to find another way out, running through the maze of gravestones. But every direction they tried led them back to the center, where Tom still stood, speaking in that eerie, unrecognizable voice. His body was swaying, and his expression had become hollow, as though whatever had taken over him was slowly consuming him from the inside out. "Please, we need to leave," Jessica cried, her eyes filled with terror. "What do we do?" That was when they noticed the figure standing just beyond Tom. An old man, his clothes tattered and faded, his eyes hollow and dark, watching them from the shadows. He did not speak, but there was an aura about him, a sense of immense power that made their hearts race with fear. And then, in a voice as cold as ice, the figure spoke, but it wasn't to them. It was to Tom. "You've come, and now you must stay," the figure said, his voice heavy with centuries of grief. "But you may leave if you promise to return." The air seemed to grow colder still, and the sound of a distant bell began to toll, echoing from deep within the cemetery. Time seemed to slow as the group huddled together, terrified and confused, not knowing if they were meant to die here, or if this was some twisted form of punishment. With great reluctance, Sarah spoke, her voice barely audible. "Well, we'll come back. I swear it. Just let us go." At those words, the gates creaked, slowly beginning to open. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and the shadows seemed to retreat. Tom, his body now slack and lifeless, collapsed to the ground, unconscious but alive. The group rushed out of the cemetery, stumbling to their car, never once looking back as they drove away, hearts pounding. But the terror didn't end there. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she heard it, a whisper, low and menacing, echoing in the dark. "You promised." The shadows in her room seemed to stir, and as her eyes closed, she saw them. Figures in the dark, watching her, waiting for her return to the cursed cemetery. She knew they wouldn't let her forget. She hadn't just made a promise to leave. She had made a promise to return. And now, the cemetery would never let her go. Story 4. The Halloween Terror. It was the most anticipated night of the year. The Halloween party at the remote cabin on the edge of town. Every year, the group of friends would gather for a night of tricks, treats, and just enough horror to get their adrenaline pumping. This year was no different, well, at least not at first. The cabin sat alone in a small clearing surrounded by dense woods, the kind of place that felt both comforting and unsettling. The friends had grown up with this tradition, and though the location was isolated, it was always filled with laughter, the crackling of the bonfire, and the flickering of jack-o'-lanterns scattered around the porch. But something about this year felt different. The air was colder, and the shadows in the trees seemed to stretch a little longer than usual. As the night unfolded, with costumes ranging from the outrageous to the macabre, everything seemed perfectly normal. They had their usual games, storytelling, and plenty of spiked punch, making their way through the evening with typical Halloween festivities. But it wasn't until the late hours that things started to take a dark turn. It all began when Tim, one of their more adventurous friends, went out to the woods to grab some firewood. He had ventured into the trees before, and nothing about the forest ever made him think twice. But tonight, under the silver glow of the full moon, there was an odd sense of stillness in the air, too still. The only sound was the crunch of fallen leaves beneath his boots. Tim's eyes were drawn to something unusual, half hidden beneath a fallen log. At first, he thought it was just an old mask someone had discarded, a leftover from last year's festivities. But as he picked it up, he felt an electric chill run down his spine. The mask was black, cracked in places, with sharp angular lines and hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through him. It was unlike any costume mask he had ever seen. It felt alive, like it had a pulse of its own. He couldn't explain it, but he was drawn to it. With a half-hearted chuckle, he took it back to the cabin. "Check out what I found in the woods," he called out as he entered, holding up the mask. The group looked at him, laughing and joking as they asked where he had found it. It wasn't uncommon to find random items in the woods, and the group assumed it was just another discarded Halloween prop. But the mask, there was something wrong about it. The way it seemed to twitch in Tim's hands, the way the air around it felt unervingly cold, made them uneasy. "Maybe we should just leave it outside," Sarah suggested, a hint of concern in her voice. But Tim, always the instigator, had other plans. It's just a mask. Come on, it'll be a great prank. Let's put it on one of you guys and freak out the others. Despite warnings from the locals about the strange happenings in the area, whispers of cursed relics and spirits lurking in the woods, the group dismissed it as superstition. The mask was just a decoration, they told themselves. What could possibly go wrong? They decided to make a game of it. Each person would take a turn wearing the mask, and the others would pretend it was some kind of spooky omen. It started off harmless enough. Mark donned it first, acting like a deranged villain as he chased the others around the cabin. Laughter echoed through the trees, but then something shifted. As Tim placed the mask on his face, he was struck by an odd, sudden rush of heat. The room seemed to close in on him, and for a moment his vision blurred. His pulse quickened, his breath shallow. He felt something stir inside him, something dark, something old. "I feel different," Tim muttered, his voice shaking, but it was clear something was wrong. The playfulness in his tone evaporated, replaced by a hollow, eerie depth. He ripped the mask off his face, but it was as if the mask was stuck to him, unwilling to let go. The others rushed to help, but before they could react, Tim threw himself back into the corner of the room with a frightening force. "I don't know what's happening." Tim's voice was no longer his own, but a deep, guttural growl. "But you're not leaving tonight." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. The friend stepped back in shock as Tim, his eyes wide and filled with an unnatural fury, turned toward them. His hands curled into fists, knuckles cracking as he slowly rose to his feet. There was a look of madness in his eyes, but it was more than that. It was as if something was controlling him, forcing him into a violent frenzy. "What the hell, Tim?" Sarah shouted, backing away. "This isn't funny anymore." Tim's smile was cruel, his movements jerky, like a marionette puppet with its strings pulled too tightly. He lunged at the group, and the friends scattered, screaming as they tried to escape his grasp. But Tim wasn't acting like himself anymore. His eyes glowed with a supernatural intensity, and his strength seemed unhinged. He tackled Mark to the floor, pinning him with ease, the veins in his neck throbbing with a dark power. "Get it off him!" Jessica screamed, her voice high-pitched in fear. The others scrambled for the door, but it was locked. The windows were shut tight, trapping them inside with a man, or rather, something that wasn't Tim anymore. The friends tried to hold him down, but each time they got close, Tim would thrash violently, slamming one of them into the walls or furniture. The mask lay on the floor, forgotten for the moment, but its dark energy still pulsed in the air. It was then that Sarah, breathless and panicked, noticed something that made her blood run cold. The mask, the way it moved when Tim touched it, the way it seemed to pulse with life. It wasn't just an ordinary Halloween prop. It wasn't just a piece of costume gear. It was a cursed artifact, a relic from some ancient, vengeful spirit. It had found a vessel in Tim, but this wasn't possession, not in the usual sense. It was far more insidious. The spirit, whatever it was, had not taken control of him outright. Instead, it was feeding on his fear, using the mask as a conduit to twist his mind and warp his body, turning him into a creature driven by rage. "You have to take it off him," Mark shouted, his voice hoarse from the struggle. "That mask, whatever it is, it's controlling him." In the chaos, someone finally managed to grab the mask. With trembling hands, Sarah picked it up, the cold metal of it pressing against her skin. As soon as she did, Tim's body stiffened, his eyes rolling back into his head. He collapsed, unconscious, the spirit momentarily freed from its host. The room was deathly silent, broken only by the distant sound of the wind howling through the trees. They all stared at Tim, who lay motionless on the floor. The mask was now nothing more than a lifeless piece of decoration. But it wasn't over. As the group gathered themselves, trying to process the horror they had just witnessed, they heard it, the faintest whisper, a voice in the darkness that sent chills down their spines. "We will return." The mask was gone. No one knew where it had gone, or if it had ever truly left. The air around them seemed to thrum with an unnatural tension, and they all knew, without speaking it aloud, that whatever they had unleashed was not finished. Next year, it would return. The spirit would be back, seeking revenge. And this time, it wouldn't just be a prank. The terror they had barely survived had planted its seeds, and next Halloween, it would bloom once again. The mask would find another, and the cycle would repeat. Story 5. The Mysterious Stranger Among Us. It had been years since they started visiting the little bar in the center of town. The dimly lit establishment had always been their favorite hangout, a place to unwind after long weeks, filled with the warm hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. Its walls, adorned with vintage beer posters and faded photos, seemed to hold the history of every night spent within. But this night, for reasons none of them could explain, felt different. The usual group of friends had gathered, sitting at their usual booth near the back. They were all in high spirits, celebrating the weekend with casual laughter and the familiarity of shared memories. The jukebox played softly in the background, a steady soundtrack to their conversations. The bartender, an old friend named Paul, waved over as he poured drinks for them, giving his usual friendly nod. But as they settled in for their usual routine, one of them, Lucy, noticed something strange. A man had entered the bar, someone none of them recognized. He wasn't young, but not old either, mid-30s, with a nondescript face that somehow felt off. He wore a dark trench coat despite the warmth of the evening and had a quiet, almost predatory air about him as he scanned the room. "Who's that?" Sarah asked, her voice lowered as she watched the stranger take a seat at the far end of the bar. "I don't know," Lucy replied, squinting, "but I haven't seen him around before." The man settled into his seat, but not once did he take his eyes off their group. It was unsettling, like he was studying them. At first, they tried to ignore him, going back to their conversations. But the more they talked, the more they felt the weight of his gaze. And then he spoke, without looking at any of them directly. His voice sliced through the noise of the bar. "You're all still together," he said softly, though it felt like a declaration, not a question. "It's good to see, but not for long." The group fell silent. There was something chilling about the way he said it, too knowing, too certain. He hadn't been part of their conversation, yet his words seemed directed at them, as though he knew things about them that no stranger could know. "Who are you?" Tim asked, his voice tentative but steady as he stood up to approach the man. "How do you know us?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. He took a slow sip from his drink, his eyes flickering to each of them in turn. Then he finally spoke, his voice low but laced with an eerie calm. "You all have your secrets," he said, his lips curling into a strange, unsettling smile. "And I know them all. The things you've kept buried, the things you think are forgotten." A shiver ran through the group, but they couldn't look away. The man didn't seem to be threatening them physically, yet there was an undeniable sense of unease that settled in their bones. Who was this person, and why did he make them feel like their lives were an open book for him to read? "You're wrong," Jessica spoke up, trying to mask her unease with defiance. "We've never seen you before in our lives." The stranger only smirked. "I haven't been here, not yet, but I know you, all of you. Your past, your present, and your future." The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavy with tension as the words hung in the air like smoke. It was as if the whole atmosphere in the bar shifted. The dim lighting, the hum of the jukebox, the sounds of casual conversation from other patrons, all of it felt distant now, irrelevant. It was just them and the stranger. He turned his attention to Sarah, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You think you've escaped your past, but it's already catching up with you," he said cryptically. Then to Mark, "The one you thought you lost will find you again, and it won't be pretty." And to Lucy, his gaze was almost pitying. "You've been running, haven't you? From something you don't want to face." The group exchanged glances, each of them feeling the weight of his words in their chest. It wasn't just that he knew them. It was how he seemed to know the very things they had buried deep, the parts of their lives they had long since tried to forget. But the strange part wasn't just the knowledge he had of them. It was what he said next. "Your end is coming," the stranger continued, his voice taking on a deeper, more foreboding tone. "I can see it, like a storm on the horizon, waiting to swallow you all. Tonight will be the beginning." A sudden chill swept over the room. It wasn't just the air. It was a thick, oppressive feeling, as though something invisible had descended upon them. The weight of his words settled heavily in their minds, as each person felt a creeping sense of dread crawl beneath their skin. "You're wrong," Tim finally said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're just some guy making wild claims." But the stranger wasn't finished. He stood up slowly, his eyes now gleaming with a strange, unsettling light. "You'll see soon enough. It's already started. You just haven't noticed it yet." Before anyone could react, he turned and walked toward the door, disappearing into the night without another word. The group sat in stunned silence, the air thick with unease. The entire bar felt unnervingly quiet, as if the stranger's words had sucked all the life out of the room. "What the hell was that?" Jessica asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Lucy muttered, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched her drink. "But I don't like it." They tried to shake it off, thinking it was just some strange person looking for attention. But as the night went on, something began to happen. The things the stranger had said, they started to come true. Mark's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it, his face paling. "That's impossible," he muttered almost to himself. He turned the screen around to show the others. A message, sent just moments after the stranger had spoken to them, read, "You're not alone. You never have been." It was a message from a number none of them recognized. Lucy's heart skipped a beat when she noticed the empty chair next to her. "Where's Tim?" she asked, suddenly aware of his absence. They all turned to look. Tim had been sitting with them moments before, but now he was gone. The bar was nearly empty except for their group, and none of them had seen him leave. "Did he go to the bathroom or something?" Sarah asked, her voice thick with unease. They waited, but Tim didn't return. They tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. And that wasn't the only oddity. Throughout the rest of the night, each of them began experiencing strange occurrences. Mark, who had been standing by the door, swore he heard someone whisper his name, but no one was there. Sarah's drink suddenly spilled on its own, splashing all over her lap. Lucy felt a strange tug on her coat, as if someone had grabbed it, but when she turned, the area behind her was empty. As the night came to a close, they decided to leave, still shaken by the bizarre events. But when they tried to leave the bar, they found that the door was locked. They knocked and banged on the windows, but the place remained eerily silent, as if no one was there. They turned to Paul, the bartender, but he had disappeared as well. No trace of him, no sign that he had ever been there. Finally, after what felt like hours, the door creaked open on its own, and they rushed outside, desperate for fresh air. But when they looked around, the town felt off, empty, as if something had shifted, as if they had never truly left the bar at all. The stranger was gone, but his words echoed in their minds. Had he been a warning? A harbinger of things to come? Or had he been something more? A ghostly figure? A manifestation of their darkest fears? They never spoke of it again, but deep down, they all knew that night had marked something, a turning point. Something dark was lurking in their future, and they couldn't escape it. Living in borrowed time, as the stranger had said. The night had grown late, and the once lively bar now seemed eerily quiet, as though the stories they'd shared had soaked into the very air around them. The group of friends sat in a tense silence, their unease growing with each passing second. Each of them had spoken of their experiences, strange happenings, inexplicable events, and encounters that still made their skin crawl. But now, with the last words spoken, the reality of it all seemed to settle like a heavy fog, leaving them unsure of what to believe. The line between what was real and what wasn't had become painfully thin. There were no clear answers, only questions. Questions about things they couldn't explain, events they couldn't forget. The stories they had told seemed to blur together, all tied by a sense of foreboding, as if something beyond their understanding was at play. Was it all just coincidence? Or had they all somehow tapped into a darker, hidden world that hovered just beyond the veil of their reality? As they sat, contemplating their own doubts, the stillness in the room felt suffocating. Their eyes kept darting to the door, as if they half expected to see the shadow of a figure watching them from the dark. And then, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah broke the silence. That man at the bar, the stranger, what do you think he was? She asked, her voice trembling ever so slightly. I don't know, Jessica replied, her voice distant. But I can't shake the feeling that he wasn't just some random person. He knew too much about us, about things we haven't even told each other. Tim, who had been quiet for the longest time, finally spoke. It was just a coincidence. We're reading too much into it. We've had a few bad nights. That's it. But his words lacked conviction, and everyone noticed. There was something about the way he said it, like he was trying to convince himself more than the others. Lucy shook her head. Maybe you're right, Tim. Maybe it's just coincidence. But what about all the strange things we've experienced? The mask, the whispers, that feeling we've all had, like we were being watched. The rest of them nodded in agreement. Each of them had felt it, the sensation that something unseen was just beyond the edge of their vision, something waiting in the dark. I don't know what's real anymore, Sarah murmured. But whatever it is, it's getting harder to tell where the story ends and reality begins. The group exchanged glances, each of them wondering if they were starting to lose their grip on the truth. Maybe it was all part of the story, a story that had no real ending, no neat conclusion. Maybe they were trapped in it, their lives forever haunted by the things they couldn't explain. And then, as if on cue, the bar door creaked open and the wind blew in, carrying with it a chill that seemed to seep into their bones. The room seemed to darken, and the shadows that danced on the walls suddenly felt a little too alive, a little too eager to stretch and crawl. A low whisper filled the air, faint at first, like a distant murmur. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakable, something ancient, something ominous. Did you hear that? Tim asked, his voice quivering as he glanced toward the door. No, Lucy said quickly, her eyes wide. But I feel it, like something's here. Mark stood up abruptly. It's nothing, just the wind. But his voice lacked the confidence it had once held, and his eyes darted nervously to the corners of the room. I'm going, Jessica said, standing to leave. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm done for the night. I think we've all had enough. Her voice was tinged with fear, but she was trying to mask it. One by one, they all stood up, leaving their drinks untouched. As they made their way to the door, the uneasy feeling grew, wrapping around them like a cold, suffocating blanket. When they stepped outside, the night air hit them like a slap in the face, cold, crisp, and unsettling. For a moment, they stood in silence on the porch, staring into the darkness. The town, usually so quiet, felt empty now, too empty. There were no sounds of crickets, no rustle of leaves in the trees, only the deep silence and the feeling that something unseen was watching them. Then Mark spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I think we're still being watched. Everyone turned to look at him, their eyes wide. Had he seen something? Had he heard something? Stop it, Jessica said nervously. You're just spooked. Let's go home. But no one moved. The air felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath their feet had shifted, and they were now standing on the edge of something far darker than they could comprehend. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and as they walked down the street, each friend began to notice small things, details they hadn't seen before. A shadow that flickered at the corner of their vision. A low whisper in the wind that seemed to follow them, like a distant voice calling their names. Their footsteps echoed too loudly, too sharply, as though the world had become unnervingly still around them. Tim was the first to stop. Did you see that? He asked, pointing into the distance. But when they turned to look, there was nothing there. I didn't see anything, Sarah said, her voice trembling. Let's just go home. But the doubt was there, lingering in their minds, as each friend felt the weight of the moment settle in their chest. What had just happened? Were they all still caught in the web of their own fears? Or was there something else, something darker, that had followed them from the bar? As they parted ways, the eerie feeling stayed with them, gnawing at the edges of their thoughts. They all made their way home in silence, unable to shake the strange sense of dread that clung to them. No one spoke of it aloud, but they all felt it, each of them wondering if they had just left something behind at that bar, something that hadn't quite finished with them yet. And as they lay in their beds that night, The whispers seemed to linger, faint and distant, just beyond the reach of their conscious minds. Were they truly safe? Or had the stories they shared somehow opened a door, one that could never be closed again? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as the line between the living and the supernatural became thinner still. Would they ever truly escape what they had invited into their lives? Or was the darkness already too close, too tangled in the shadows, for them to outrun? The answer, it seemed, would remain forever uncertain. The haunting was not over, not yet, and the spirits they had encountered, were they truly gone? Or were they still following, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves again? Perhaps the most terrifying thought of all was the one that came last. If they could no longer tell the difference between the living and the dead, how would they ever know if they were truly safe? The lingering dread of that thought would stay with them for the rest of their lives, a shadow forever cast over their every step.